Okay, let's look at some new directions in equivalence theory now. And we're talking mainly about Anthony Pym's influence on this theory. Pym's a scholar who is actually now working at the University of Melbourne, but he has done a lot of work out of Spain. He's a bit of what I call a rock star theorist. He likes to be provocative and he likes to shake things up a bit. So some students find Pym a little bit difficult to digest, and I understand that that can be an issue with Pym, but just take him with a grain of salt is my advice. In any case, he describes the theoretical reasoning behind the notions of equivalence. So he spends a lot of time talking about how the theory arose and describing the theory in all its various shapes and forms. As I said earlier in the seminar, he sits with this idea that what we say in one language has the same or can have the same value when it's translated into another language, so that languages have similar value, but we're not always clear about where that value lies. He also focuses on this idea of the source text and the target text being related. So it doesn't matter how far you deviate when you translate a text, it still has to relate back to that source text, and that's where, for him, this equivalent relationship can lie. And he also thinks that equivalence shouldn't merely be dismissed, as some of the theorists we just looked at were so quick to do so. He actually thinks it merits a serious place alongside and within the more recent paradigms. And I guess that's the issue with equivalence. It was one of the earliest proper attempts at theorization in translation studies. It's obviously been overtaken by various other approaches. It's now a very old theory, and for that reason it does get cast aside. But it's an important one to learn about, and we certainly still talk about equivalence when we talk about translation. So it certainly still does have some kind of place within the contemporary application of translation studies. Anyway, Pym distinguishes a little bit differently to NIDA. So he talks about natural equivalence, or what is usually said in the target culture. So this means that an equivalent is already there before we translate. This is, of course, similar to formal equivalence. So he says the common expression on one side should correspond to the common expression on the other side. And it corresponds to what most translators, clients and end users believe about translation. So he's basically saying here that most people, or lay people as I described earlier, think that translation is all about word matching. And we, of course, as translators or emerging translators, know that that's not true. It's about far more than word matching, and word matching isn't always possible. Directional equivalence is basically the opposite. It doesn't assume that the equivalence is natural or reciprocal, so it doesn't assume that we already have an equivalent at our fingertips. And the example that Pym gives is that if you translate from language A into language B and then you go back, so perhaps you translate from German into English and then you go back to German, the result might not be where you started. So if you're using a theory of directional equivalence, this gives you a choice of various different strategies which are not necessarily dictated by the source text. So you're not tied to the source text. You're not producing a source text oriented translation. You could be deviating quite significantly from that source text in order, as of course NIDA said, to come up with something that functions well in the target culture. But it might mean that you don't get back to point A in that process. So how do we know whether something is natural or directional? Well, Pym suggests using back translation. So, do we get back to point A or not? If there is natural equivalence, you end up where you started. So for most languages, let's use table again. You start off with table in English, you translate table into Chinese, and you get back to table in English again. It's when you translate idioms or culturally loaded terms that you might not get back to point A. And this is where an approach of directional equivalence might be more helpful. But if we think back to that example of a bull in a china shop, if we have to translate that into language B, we might end up with something very, very different to a bull in a china shop, which might mean that we don't get back to point A. So another little activity for you is to translate the terms crazy as a cut snake and Scotch college into your languages, and to see what approach you take. You might need to do some research into these terms if you're not a local, and I'd be interested to see what you come up with in the workshop. Okay, finally we're going to look very briefly just to flag what Newmark came up with in terms of his distinction between semantic and communicative translation. So communicative, all of these theories are pretty much describing similar things, I might just add. Communicative translation relates quite closely to NIDA's dynamic equivalence. So this is about communicating the same effect on the target reader. So where communication is the key. Semantic translation is more similar to formal equivalence. And what Newmark does that's a little bit different to what NIDA does with his theories of equivalence is to include aspects such as time, culture and context. So he's starting to move in the direction that the cultural turn theorists are going, which is not only to look at the text as a text, but also to look at where the text appears, in what context it appears, and whether there are any cultural aspects that need to be taken into consideration. So the example that Newmark uses is, would a modern British translation of Homer, for example, produce the same effect on the target readers as the source text readers had in ancient Greece? When we're talking about these theories, we also need to consider issues of relatedness. So that basically means how closely related are your languages and cultures, and is the translation risk therefore lower or higher? So if we're talking about an Anglophone culture and a European culture, we could say that they're quite closely related. Therefore, there is less risk of us having any major issues with equivalence in those two languages or those two cultures. However, if we have particularly an Anglophone or a European culture and an Asian culture, we might find that there is a lot more risk involved as those cultures and languages sit at a greater distance. Similarly, we can have cultures that are close but languages that are different. So we can have situations where various languages are spoken in one country. We have the example of Switzerland, for example, which has German, Italian, French, and Romansh. And we have one culture but various languages. And again, can we assess the risk here of being high or low? And we might have both languages and cultures being vastly different. So these are also issues we need to take into consideration when we translate. Just a table here to outline how some of these theories sit alongside one another. So we have, of course, the distinction between foreignization and domestication that Schleiermacher came up with. We now have also our understanding of NIDA's formal versus dynamic equivalence. We have Newmark's semantic and communicative. We will move on to discuss some of the other ones you can see on the screen here as the semester proceeds. But you can see already how some of these are aligned. And this is the issue that we were talking about before with the binaries that exist in translation studies. Quite often translation studies is viewed as, a table with two columns. It's either this approach or that approach. But in terms of learning about the theories and how they arise and where they sit, this is a helpful way for you just to get your head around them. Some final criticisms of equivalence. It's been named as being too subjective, not actually scientific. Again, too concerned with word level, not text or culture. But what we do need to realise is that these theorists did succeed in getting translations or studies away from that kind of vague literal versus free debate which had existed up until then. But we will be talking about this further in the workshop, and I'd be interested to hear what you think about this particular theory and how helpful or unhelpful it might be to you as a translator. A summary, we have a quote here from Susan Bassinet. And she says, translation involves far more than the replacement of lexical and grammatical items between languages. Once the translator moves away from close linguistic equivalence, the problems of determining the exact nature of the equivalence aimed for begin to emerge. But the summary does put particular emphasis on the fact that in this attempt to scientificise, if one can use that term, translation studies, we did successfully move translation studies away from this very subjective and very basic understanding of the issues involved in translation.